You were just talking about how you pioneered PUE for the sake of this one customer. Right. And how you, I think one of the most punk rock things that you've ever said was how you basically had to fight a fight inside your business. So you went and weaponized and collected and built an army within the industry to help define standards that you go back to your company and be like, this is what we got to do.
It was easier to have the industry move than the company.
Yeah, they're like, hey, I think we should do this. Like, well, let's wait and see what the industry thinks. You're like, okay, hold my beer. Yeah. You go and you come back and like, hey guys, what do you think? And then you come back and like, hey, they all said this is what we got to do.
Exactly.
And that's what you guys are doing.
Now, it didn't happen in the course of a day, right? That was,
But I imagine back in those days, you were very intentional and you began that journey with the end in sight and how you expected that to play out. So, and then it ended up going into the Green Grid. And for those that don't even know what the Green Grid is, and when did that start, by the way?
Green Grid was 2006, I think, is when it started.
And it was like 4 of you that started the Green Grid?
Four people.
What was the purpose?
The purpose was to drive efficiency into data center design.
Less waste of power?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, because here's the interesting thing. When we measured PUE, this is like when it started in the late 90s, if I recall, but between that late 90s to 2006, the data centers we visited, when you calculate the PUE, in some cases it was more than 3.
Oof.
And best cases were 2.
But they had in their defense, they had no idea to measure it. No one had a PUE metric yet. Right.
And I remember the big arguments people were having. Well, people could game the metric.
Oh yeah.
And I'm like, who cares?
Calculated versus actual. There's
all these arguments. It's like, who cares? I don't care about that. If you want to compare to the other guy, great. And there was always arguments. They'll be gaming it. And I'm like, I don't care. The reality is, however you measure it, as long as you're improving it, you're going to be driving better efficiency in your data centers. And, what I'm really proud about when I think about PUE, the industry is using half the power. If we were at between 2 and 3, and now we're at 1.1, 1.3, something like that. Some people are even getting close to 1 with liquid cooling, right? I would argue that's huge. Just think about how much power savings that is for everyone. Now, granted is, because that drove costs down, your electric bill is less, your designs are better. Maybe we expanded more rapidly because of Javon's paradox. If you make a resource cheaper, you consume more of it, right? So maybe it actually made us grow even more rapidly. But despite that, it is happening more efficiently. And so I'm pretty proud of the fact that we have saved significant power on this planet because of PUE.
Well, that leads into, because I feel like we're getting closer to where you're at today, right? And where those passions are. You have passion projects and things that are really important for you. And it sounds like, the Green Grid and efficiencies and less waste became something that you were really engineering into your legacy as you were building things. We haven't left HP yet. We just started the Green Grid. Green Grid was you and a few other guys that were picking up where you left off on the PV, which was the genesis behind the awakening, which people are like, okay, now we can measure if we're doing things good or bad. Now that we can measure what good and bad looks like, then we can define a standard that we want to target, and then we can hold people accountable, right? And that was a game changer in this industry. Don't you agree? Look, it's language in every lease now. So now you're there, you're building Green Grid. At what point did you transition away from HP? How much longer were you there, and what was it? Was there something that you wanted to go be a bigger part of, and you knew Microsoft was going to be the answer for that?
So I really loved HP, and I thought I was going to be a lifer. I pretty much knew all the executives. And,
Mark Hurd was the CEO back then?
Mark Hurd was when I left during Mark Hurd era. And, but I was there with Lou Platt and then Carly and then Mark Hurd at the end, or at least my end.
I was there with Peter with Leo Apathiker and then Meg Whitman after that.
Oh yeah. That was, it never got better. I don't know about Meg, but Leo I heard was a nightmare. But anyway, but while I was at HP, I was also getting a lot of patents, and it had to do with efficiency, energy, computer architecture, because I was still part of the computer architecture team. And I think when I left in 2007, I had maybe about 50 patents. But the thing I remember there is, and I hired some great people, which, by the way, probably all the great people, or 50% of them, all moved and ended up working at Microsoft after, I started the thing, and then
a whole huge exodus. That's how it works.
Huge exodus, right? Over the next 5 years. But I remember there's another guy who I have a lot of patents with, Eric Peterson, who actually came to Microsoft as well. And he was one of many. There's maybe Roy Zagami, the young gun we hired out of Stanford, that we would be in a meeting and someone would say, "Oh, you can't do that. That can't be done." And so anytime we would hear that after the meeting, we would get in a room and just get a bunch of us together that don't like the word can't. And we would say, okay, how would you do this? And let's
go prove them wrong.
Prove them wrong, right? And that's how we came up with a lot of those first 50 patents. Was we just didn't believe in the word
system, yeah.
Can't, right? Can't is the challenge, right? And so that was a key thing for driving a lot of the patents that I have. And I always would have it with different people, because sometimes you would just realize that you need diversity of thought. Sometimes we would pull in someone who had no concept of the field we're even working on, and we'd tell them, look, this is the problem. This is what we're trying to do. And they would ask a stupid question. Well, why would you do that? Why not just do this? Why are you even thinking of that? It's like,
from the outside looking in, they saw it differently.
They saw it differently. And so that was really the emergence for me to really understanding the importance of diversity of thought.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm a big proponent for diversity, because diversity brings diversity of thought, which brings massive innovation and change. Because if you're a diverse organization, and you can define diversity however you want, but the key thing for me is I want you to be thinking differently. And the best way to do that is get people from all over the world, right? So anyway, and so that drove a lot of the patents.
But what got you to Microsoft? What inspired you to leave what you were doing because you liked HP? Am I taking you back to a spot that I shouldn't?
No, it's fine. No, it's I actually turned Microsoft down twice before accepting the third time.
Because I assumed something like that.
Yeah. In 2006, so there was a article they did on me. Dallas Morning News did an article in the business section, and I still have this. It was really about innovators. And I was on the cover, and I had the wall of patents behind me. Well, that article actually got reprinted in the Denver Post and Seattle Times. It was, I forgot what they called it.
Spread like wildfire.
Yeah, but it was reprinted in all these other newspapers. And in 2006, I think, when it was printed in Seattle Times, it put me on the radar for a guy called Arne Josephsberg. Great guy. I love him to this day. But he called me a couple of times, and each time I'm like, well, you're a software company. What would I do in a software company? Very short-sighted again. And then the third time he called, and he had hired this guy called Dilip Bandekar. And they're like, here, you need to come and just come interview. And I'm like, all right, I'll come. And I came up summer, I think it was June.
You were living in Houston then?
I was still in Dallas. I commuting to Houston. And I going up in the summer of Seattle, when it's really hot right here, was actually a nice thing. And I could take my family. They wanted me to bring my family and everything up there. And I met with these guys, and I met with James Hamilton, for me, another key influencer in my life.
Is that the guy that went to Amazon?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I had such a good time with James in the interview. He gave me a technical interview, and we were brainstorming, and we were inventing on the spot about data centers. And in fact, we had several patents together before he left for Amazon. But I had so much freaking fun with that guy that I'm like, and I literally had no sleep the night before. So I was tired. I thought I was going to bomb the interview, but he just was my first person I interviewed with, it just pumped me and it got me so excited about the innovation that could happen at Microsoft that I went back. I had an offer already on the way back to the airport, and I was just sitting there going, and this is to your earlier comment about discomfort. I'm like, but I have a cake job right now at HP. Everyone knows me. I have a good life. And but the package they were giving me also was really kind of life-changing compared to how HP has their compensation. But I had a great life in Dallas. I love Dallas. Excuse me. So I'm down in Austin here, right, in July, visiting my parents, and I'm like, here's my dilemma. And I'm just sitting there thinking, I don't know what to do. I think I'm going to turn it down. Oh, but before I go there, let's see. I might have the timing wrong. So the next story I'm about to tell you could have happened before or after, but was a key part of my decision as well. But I'm sitting there on my computer, still undecided about the whole thing, and all of a sudden, bloop, I see Bill Gates reached out.
No way.
Yeah. And he told me all the reasons I should join Microsoft, and that Microsoft is going through a change. It's going to be going to the cloud. And, Microsoft wanted me because of my efficiency expertise. They wanted to make sure they had efficient strategy with the growth in the data center arena. And I'm like, I typed back to him, and bloop, he sent a note back again. And I'm like,
how crazy is that?
This is crazy. Mark Hurd would have never done this.
Yeah, no
right. And so, clearly the guys, Arna and Dilip, probably got Bill to send a note, right?
But that's got to be pretty gangsta that Bill Gates personally was sending notes telling you why to come.
And so I'm telling my parents, boy, I think this is a good motivation for me to come. And so whatever the strategy was,
it worked.
It worked, right? But it was that incident that got me to Seattle. But there was another one too. I was a good friend of mine, Jack Grimmett, who I worked with at TI, but we remain friends to this day. I was telling him the whole story too, and I go, I'm trying to decide between these two, and of course I laid it out for him, and he goes, so going to Microsoft, does that make you feel uncomfortable? I go, hell yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
And he goes, that's why you should take it. And that's
Who
another
asked
one.
You this?
This is my buddy, Jack Grimmett.
Sounds like your father could have asked you that.
Yeah, no,
too, huh?
it was. He's a great human being, great person, really blessed to have him as a friend. He ended up going on in TI he was responsible for the DLP system. And so his team built all the DLP systems for theaters and the old DLP projection TVs. And so he's been quite influential in his own right too. So, but at that time we were still just kids, I would say. But he had such great advice. And so between that and the Bill Gates thing, the rest is history. And
did he high five you once you showed up? He's like, hey, did the right thing. Gave you like one of those swats in the boot. Hey, good game.
I don't even think he remembers telling me this, right? And so if he ever listens to this, he'll be like, I said that? I'm sure that's how he is. He's a very humble person and just great guy.
When was that when you got to?
2007. By August of 2007, I was here. I had bought a house in the Seattle area, and I've been there ever since.
I got you. And then trying to think of what was the most pivotal part of our industry at that time. Because in 2007, I remember that seems like when 10 megawatt deals were a huge deal. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's correct.
I mean, that's
when
what
you went into
was.
a 5 megawatt data center. I remember
You're like,
Allen, Texas. I don't know who owns that data center now, but it was 5 megawatts. It was like 10,000 square feet or something. And it was like, wow.
And now that's not even retail colo, right?
Yeah, it was tiny, and
but that's massive back in those days, right?
It is, and so that's exactly where the industry was. I mean, we're just breaking up to the 10, going over 10, and in fact, at Microsoft at the time, in 2007, they opened the Quincy data center, which was the first phase of it, which was 13.5 megawatts, right? Something like that. And that was massive. And I remember, the whole thing that we'd go in and people like David Gauthier was part of the team that built that data center. And it was like, God, we're going to get fired. We'll never fill this thing.
Is this what was called like the chicken coop or something like that? Which
no, that's
Quincy.
Yahoo. That was Yahoo. But
was that Timmons then?
Yeah. Okay. Which there's a story in that as well, actually.
I knew all you guys were all the same.
Yeah. He was my boss for a little bit.
Was he really?
Yeah. So remind me to tell you that story. He's a great guy too. I love him.
But Quincy, you were doing Quincy.
Yeah, and so that was our first big foray. And then,
how did you know Quincy? Do you mind if I ask? I don't want to take you off your train of thought here, but it was fascinating for a lot of us to be like, that's a pretty arbitrary place to just go.
Cheap electricity and the network ran through there. That was the primary thing.
Okay.
Right? I mean,
hydroelectric power.
Hydroelectric power was so cheap. That
would make more sense.
Yeah.
Is that because you guys...
And that became a major campus.
Everyone else followed too, right?
Absolutely.
So back in those days, was there anyone that was doing more in this space than Microsoft was at that time? Because
Google. Google was doing more. They were way ahead of everyone because of search, and Microsoft was competing with search. That was what was driving our growth. Was
the Bings.
It was live search then became Bing. Yeah. And so that drove it.
I always wondered like how much of a percentage of that growth was coming from the stuff that you couldn't anticipate, from like an Xbox game getting a high adoption rate that no one could anticipate, or like, was it it was probably just cloud.
It was mostly Bing back then.
Really? Driving all that, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's why, don't want to necessarily jump ahead, but that's why we did containers and 3.9's data center, because search didn't need as resilient of a data center. And that's why we were experimenting with that back then. But there's things I remember when I first started at Microsoft. Another guy that has pretty much worked for me my whole time at Microsoft, and has been a great partner all along, was Sean James. And he was one of the first guys that came in to meet me, because, and if he tells the story, it'll be something like this. He goes, I heard they hired the PUE guy and I wanted to meet him. And so he sent me mail saying, hey, I'd love to meet with you. And I'm like, okay, yeah, great. I'm kind of lonely. I'm still trying to get to know people. And so he comes in my office and we start talking. He's another one of these guys that I have so many patents with, because we're curious and we love to kind of brainstorm and think bigger. And I think many people know Sean already, because he's very active in the industry. But he comes in, and he was at that time, I think he was maybe the data center manager for one of our old leased facilities, a much smaller site. And I'm telling him, Sean, I'm going into these data centers and they're beautiful. They're amazing. This new data center in Quincy, unbelievable. I love it. And I'm looking at it going, yeah, but what I don't understand is, why do we have these cooling systems? I mean, I used to design servers, and the servers should operate to 35°C. Why are we keeping the temperature so tight? I said, I would just love to run a data center under a tent. And Sean goes, I love people that think like this. He goes,
hold my beer.
Let's do it. I go, what? He goes, yeah, put a tent up in the back of my data center, in the fuel yard, and we'll put some racks in there, decommissioned racks, and just run them and see what happens.
And see what happens.
And we did it.
And what happened? What was the predictions?
Well, we had no idea. We just wanted to see. I mean, my prediction was it would be just fine. And
depends on the season, I guess. Huh?
Well, it ran through the winter, if I recall.
Wow.
And then it ran for 9 months or something like that through the summer. Now, granted, it's Seattle, so it's not Dallas.
Sure.
but everything ran fine. A few times there was a leak in the canopy and water leaked on top, which of course is not safe necessary, but it continued running. The servers continued running. A few times in the fall, the leaves would suck to the front and we'd have to pull the leaves off, especially the low ones. And then we had a failure. The lowest server failed.
From what?
Well, we sent it back to the vendor. I don't want to say who it is, to RCA the thing. And they came back and said, we've never seen this failure before. And we're like, what? And it's, well, the server was full of mud. And we're like, really? We don't know how that happened. We didn't, of course, admit that we had it running outside, but it was essentially vacuuming up the moisture and the dust all the time. And it was the lower server. The others were fine. But the failure happened because we weren't filtering. So, but that, we did a blog on that tent with the server rack in there. It went viral. And it was the beginning of economization of data centers. Prior to that, there was really no one was economizing data centers. And that's what kind of drove that. So it's just really funny how these little stupid experiments we do kind of change how people view things. And it helped PUE immensely, right? And that was how we sold it.
How collaborative was a lot of these ideas that were being exchanged? Like, where were you guys collectively meeting, you and the others that are in the industry that had influence like you do?
It was TC 9.9 and Green Grid at the time.
So those were the
conferences, and then just some conferences, right? It was the beginning in around 2006 or 5, I think, is when Data Center Dynamics started.
Sure.
George started that whole thing, and it was a great event where we were starting to get to know each other better. We were already through these other bodies like the Green Grid were developing relationships, but more and more of that continued in that time frame
through the conferences.
Yeah,
I feel like the industry itself is a bigger island than it used to be. It used to be a bunch of tiny islands, right? But I feel like these conferences do allow for a greater exchange of ideas, and that is where you drive the disruption. And I mean, you've been to our conference, I think, one time, you said, right? And
I never actually have been at the conference.
All right, you just go to the dinner.
Yeah.
Well, listen, that's unfortunate. You'll have to come.
Yeah.
Peter's spoken at it. There's a bunch of other guys that
Yeah.
I think that you go trucking with that have. And my thing is, I really like it when there's a provocative idea. Dean does a great job of like leaving something there subtly and challenging people to really start thinking about that. So, I mean, when you're done, you're not educated on what he's talking about. You're just aware that you need to learn more about that. And I think that that's disruptive, right? And that's how you force people, you inspire people, or you challenge people to go out and start learning these things on their own. So we could pick up where you guys left off. When you guys were doing this, I mean, like you said, you were the one defining the standards to support the inner needs of your business, right? Now there are standards, and we have a fairly sophisticated industry, and a lot of these people that have been here as long as you have are armed to the teeth with certain things, right? So there's a lot of things that we know not to do now too.
Yeah.
But how did it evolve to where you and others that are in the same charge as you in terms of like they have the same magnitude of responsibility or the same expectations from their leadership? How did and when did you guys come together and be like,
yeah, this is interesting. So to answer, like you mentioned, Dean, and the great thing about Dean is he records every conversation and takes photos, and he probably has the history book.
He has a photo of the first day he met me, like, how many years ago? He's like, he's like, oh yeah, we met on April 14th in 2000,
exactly.
whatever.
That's Dean.
Yeah.
And he knows exactly the day. So I'm going to give you a date. It's probably wrong, but I do know it was while I was at HP. He and I were on a panel on a stage at the Data Center Users Group Conference for Emerson Power. This is back in Columbus. And I know he's got that date written down. He's got a picture.
Of course.
It's all documented. The guy's like a savant with that kind of stuff. And anyway, we were actually had a differing opinion in that panel. And I remember initially like really being bothered by Dean. And I don't know if he remembers this or not. But now we're like the best of friends. But our relationship goes back in the early 2000s, right? And it's been a wonderful journey with him. And I think he's been an amazing advocate to bringing everything out and getting teams to collaborate and people to collaborate. So it's been really a key part of the journey. But Dean
got a lot of energy for it too.
Yeah, Dean was back then. And, I'm trying to think also the interesting thing, until 2010, I never managed a single person in my career. And that was at that 2010 from the 80s. So what are we talking? It's like 30 years I never managed a single person ever.
Wow.
I was always an individual contributor, a distinguished engineer at HP, or called technologist back then. I don't know what they call it today. And so I was just a kind of a data center strategist at Microsoft.
Every problem got thrown over the fence to you to probably figure out, right?
Yeah, right. And so I liked kind of thinking through the hard problems and helping set kind of the strategy for how we move forward. That's kind of how my aura developed. And then in 2010, and of course I'm going to conferences presenting, and Mike Manos and I would even joint present, and Mike Manos was really the one that did the first, 100 megawatts in Microsoft. He was the one that was responsible for Quincy and operations and construction, right? But in the early years, and then, I don't remember exactly when he left. It was probably 2-3 years after I joined Microsoft. But I had the opportunity to work with him, and he was great. I loved that guy too. So that's when I was working with him. But then there was an organizational change. Arne Josephsberg left the team, and we had a new guy come in, Dane Sampson, who will pop up again here in a moment. But it was an opportunity for me to go to Microsoft Research to do research on data center of the future. Well, needless to say, I wasn't really enjoying myself there, because I've been a product guy and always developing something versus something way out there. So it didn't quite agree with me. And so I wanted to get back into the old group I was in. And in the meantime, this guy, Kevin Timmons, got hired by Microsoft. I really liked him. And we would talk a lot, and he wanted me to come back to be his technology strategist and leave Microsoft Research. So I talked with Dane and Kevin, and I went back to be Kevin's strategist, and he was running operations, the server team, and everything. It was called DCS at the time, Data Center Services. And I was happy. I was so glad to be back. And then Kevin announced he's leaving. And it's like
Apple what? Or something, or
there's a whole host of stuff that happened, but ultimately he went to become the CTO at CyrusOne, which was a great move.
That's
for
where
him.
I met him.
Yeah. And
I met him 10 times. He still wouldn't recognize me right now.
He's just a great person. He's also a car guy. So we connect at a personal level too, not just from a work level, but really was bummed when he left. And so they were in search of a new leader for data center services. We'd bring people through. I'd be part of the interview process, interviewing them. And Dane would come to me and go, "Christian, I think you should do this." I go, "Are you crazy?" Because by that time we had teams all over the world. It was, I don't know, maybe 120 people or something like that at the time. And the way we ran operations there, each data center had like 2 or 3 employees, and then the rest were hired guns to run the data center, right, through the various services. And I'm like, "Dane, I'll just help you interview. I'll find you a good person." And 6 months goes by, and we still don't have anyone. And Dane kind of said, you should do this, at least try it. And I'm like, I talked to my wife. I said, this is going to change my life, because I'm going to have to be woken up in the middle of the night. Also, I've never managed anybody. And this is what I would tell Dane. I mean, you'll be good at it. You'll be good at it. And I'm like, all right, whatever. And so I get back to him. I go, and I started thinking about the fact that I came to work for Kevin to be a strategist. I liked working on future stuff. I liked working on stuff no one else worked on. But we couldn't hire anyone to run the current stuff. And I realized there is no strategy if there's no today, right? We have to be successful today. And so that was starting to make me think, this is about this discomfort thing that Jack talked about with me. It looks really uncomfortable. So I went to Dane. I go, Dane, I'll do it for 3 months and we can reevaluate. By the way, I do have the option to back out of this, right? And he goes, yeah. And so I did it for 3 months. It was the hardest transition I've ever had in my career. I mean, all of a sudden being a manager, now all of a sudden having to worry about other people's problems and other things that went awry that I felt like I had no control, right? And I have this whole philosophy, only focus on things you control and not those you don't control. I felt I was in an uncontrolled situation, right? And so, after 3 months, I'm like, and a lot of different stuff happened. I told Dane, I don't know if he remembers this or not, but I kind of said, I think I don't want to do this anymore. He goes, it's too late.
Burn the ships.
Yeah. You're doing a great job. Continue doing it. And that's really how I got into management, how I got into managing essentially the whole thing, data center services, operations, which I've never done before, construction, which I've never done before, site selection, which literally was all stuff I've never done before. It was a very hard time. I would lie if I said it was a piece of cake. It was hard, but I have to say it was also probably the most rewarding time of my career. What I learned and the relationships I developed and the help I was getting from the different people in the team. And I have some really strong bonds with the people that I work with, like Brian Mattson. He was my procurement guy, which I've never done before. And I look at, the awards that I'm getting and everything. None of these awards would happen without all of these people that were there. I mean, without Dan Costello, who was there to help as well, right? Now, granted, he never worked for me because he went to Google, but all these people were always there to help me, right? And I can't be more thankful with all these folks. Steve Solomon, Steve Ford. All these guys were part of my leadership team. And then I hired in 2010 Brian Janis. I had to fight to get a head count to hire an energy guy. And now Brian is probably one of the most valuable players in the energy sector in our industry right now. He built a team in the hundreds by the end of his tenure at Microsoft. And it's all these people that helped me become their success. This is the beauty if you have a collaborative environment. You each succeed through the success of everyone else in your ecosystem. And so I remember it was really, really a tough time in the beginning, but by the end, I absolutely loved it. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not an operations guy. And so when I had the opportunity to spin off various organizations, I did. And so in the end of my, management of the day-to-day part of the team, I did site select. I had spun everything off except site selection, the network team, energy, the leasing organizations, the one that went and cut all the leases for all the data centers, and a few other teams I still had.
You got rid of construction and operations, though.
I got rid of that, but I always hired someone. Doug Mouton was hired to lead that part of the team, the construction and procurement. And so he's at Meta now. But there were all these strategies to kind of get back to my roots, which was the future. Now, the cool thing that I learned during my tenure, in that decade tenure of leading this larger organization, that, it was 120 when I started. By the end, it was like 1,000, and now it's thousands and thousands of people, right? Sure. In the past 5 years. But what was I going to say? I kind of forgot my train of thought. But anyway, it was a great time where we were all learning, and all these people were just a key part of driving change and development of humans, actually. I mean, that's what management really became. And what I learned was how to motivate people, how to inspire people. So that was a really key part of my own development. And that's really, I think, how you have to look at your career. Each sector of your career, if you look back, you'll see there's key things that happen in your development. And for me, becoming a manager, how old was I? I must have been like in my late 40s when I became a manager for the first time. And not only did I become a manager, I became a manager of a global team all over the world overnight, with different cultures and everything. And it was just, looking back, just like Don pissed me off and made me very uncomfortable because I had to write those reports. He was really setting the stage for how you get uncomfortable and grow to, even a much harder and a much more overwhelming situation, and you grow very, very rapidly.
What was the most rewarding part that you were taking away from this journey then? Was it what you were doing individually? Because what you were doing individually transcends beyond what you do for work, right? I mean, it's the type of father you could be or the type of whatever you are as a man. Were you seeing like a symbiotic relationship with your work to where as you were growing, it was, one thing was feeding the other's growth or ebb and flow?
Well, it's the constant learning. It was constant learning. I love Gandhi's saying, live today like you're dying tomorrow and learn today like you're living forever, right? I think for me, the thing that keeps me going and wanting to even live is this constant learning. And I think this is the beauty of large ecosystems and look, I was not the expert at construction. I was not the expert at procurement. I'm not the expert at energy. I'm an expert at probably fluid dynamics and heat transfer, although that's getting rusty because I've moved away from that. But at the end of the day, you leverage everyone around you. It's the greatness of everyone else that makes everything great, right? And so, I also learned, for example, that innovation is not just about technology. It's about business innovation, right? Through Brian Janis and being really creative and his team becoming really creative of how to structure deals so that everyone gets what they want. I look back to the early days, when I looked at how we were building our data centers and the growth path we were on. This is like in 2012 or actually even before that, where I'm looking at it going, there's no way we can construct all this. We have to rely on an ecosystem. And, among the first people I met, I don't know one, he might have a better idea, but it was probably around 2012, Hussein,
Cloud HQ.
Right? Cloud HQ. I mean, you talk about a very influential and very successful person in this space. Hussein's amazing, right? But I remember cutting a deal with him, which was the deal we had was we could lease any space anywhere in the country for the same low rate. He had the vision that it was going to be people like Microsoft that are going to transform this industry, and he was willing to take a much lower rate than anybody else in the region. And we kind of started this whole thing about, give me what your risks are. I'll try to take on that risk if it's more expensive for you to take that risk on than me. And so we had this really great relationship where he could still be profitable, but we could get much better lease rates, which is why we did a lot of leases with him. As a result, we became really good collaborators together. And that model essentially extended my reach in terms of my construction team. And then I started looking at it going, wait, that community, the lessers, are really another build team. It's just a different financial mechanism, right?
Yeah.
There's no difference. Instead of a GC, I deal with the CEO. And then is it a lease, or do we take it out of our own coffers, the money? Really didn't matter. There's some different ways to handle it financially in terms of depreciation, all that stuff. But I started looking at the community as part of my team. And the same thing happened, in the early days with Vantage and Edge Connects and Interaction and all these guys. We weren't doing just retail leasing anymore. It was not even wholesale. It was really kind of a specialized way to understand each other's requirements and what are the specs. This goes back to the old days with Uptime, where we need to understand our specs together, and then we can optimize and drive costs down if we understand each other. And so in the early days of our growth, we relied heavily on leases. And to this day, I think we still do. Or when I say we, the industry, but back then it was Microsoft. And so I have this great relationship with all those guys that I was there when they started almost from nothing. And the growth happened because they were just another piece in the ecosystem to help us grow. And I think that's where, you were asking about relationships. A lot of the relationships were just happening through the day-to-day business when we were open-minded enough to think about things differently as opposed to purely transactional.
Yeah.
And so I think that model is a great model. Of course, now it becomes this critical mass when the community starts working together. Then you want to be together more. You're trying to understand each other's problems. The conferences, it ended up being you go to conferences, you don't actually go to the actual presentations, but it was more about the talks you had with people.
The networking.
So it became the networking thing, which goes back to what my dad said: nourish your network.
Yeah.
Right. And so those were all the kind of the ways that all these relationships emerged. And then we became friends with, our competitors. We started seeing we're trying to solve the same problems. We're really not competing on data centers,
Resource.
but we thought we were, right? Oh, I have a lower cost to build than you have a lower cost. Is that really how we differentiate? No, we differentiate on the services, right? And so how can we work together? And this becomes especially critical now with the scarcity of resources, energy, people, and all these things. How do we actually work together to try to drive more of a commoditized environment where we can just continue and grow together? Everyone wins. There's no losers. The crazy thing about this industry, there's no losers.
Right. I think, that wholesale to the wholesalers model is what you're talking about. How do we start master plan? Like, imagine if we master planned Virginia, how much more efficiency we would have gained instead of everyone just buying pockets and meatballs. And
Totally.
And I think that's what Quantum is trying to do, Quantum Loophole, right? And I actually have their CEO, Josh Nohorn, coming in today to give us a state of the union.
Josh.
Yeah, good dude, right?
Yeah.
He was at Cyrus with all of us. I want to hear what's going on, because that is the pioneering change, right? Is master planning large wholesale
Absolutely.
campuses that wholesale providers and large enterprise hyperscale end users or baby scalers can still take space on that land, right?
Absolutely.
Purpose built.
Yeah, and because especially now with the situation with
power.
energy, is no one really wants to be the sole investor in a power plant, right? Because that takes so long to develop, particularly nuclear. Who's going to want to invest in that and then find out you didn't really need it, or your business has changed? In 10 years in our space, a lot can change.
Sure.
Right? So how do you take that risk? Well, the reality is you do a consortium, right? And this is certainly something I've been talking about as well. And, I know Josh and others are looking at doing this, but consortiums are going to be the future, where we share risk. Everything you do, even when we were doing leases versus builds, it's all about how do you mitigate risk? At the end of the day, that's all that matters. It's nothing else. In our space is how do you mitigate risks so the business can continue to grow? Every business should be doing that, right? And so when you look at these huge developments that have to happen, you've got to come up with models that mitigate the risk. Consortiums are a way to do that, where what if Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, Google, all of them decide, we're going to go on a campus. We're going to together buy a campus, invest and pay for the power plant. And we all have, certain arrangements and agreements that we take a minimum capacity, but we don't have to take all the capacity.
Yeah, so they're all shouldering the burden together.
We're all shouldering the burden together. And then someone may not need all the capacity, but someone else's business would. I mean, it's a portfolio.
Do you think that could happen?
I think it's going to have to happen.
Do you think we have the leaders in place today that could help pioneer that and bring that together?
Yes, I do. I think, there's more and more talk about that. Now, of course, it's not just the data center leaders that have to really buy into that. It's also going to be
the builders,
the owners, right? And it's, certainly I think if I were to share something like that with Joe Cava or Eric Wilcox, they probably all agree to that. But there's still the ecosystem above them that still are competing, right? This whole thing of how do you compete yet collaborate, which I think is going to be something that's going to take some cultural revolution for our industry to work through. And I do think it's going to happen because the investments are going to be so large.
Yeah, there's going to be no choice. Let me ask you this. We have a short amount of time as we bring this podcast back, and I hope that I get the opportunity to bring you back again. I feel like I have the exclusive already by talking about the new award that you made the Hall of Fame yesterday. I think I'd love to hear in the last 10, 15 minutes of this podcast, as not the party was over, but you were at a point where you were moving on from Microsoft, or you've moved on from Microsoft. What are some of the things that really excite you the most about this industry? I know what we both agree on a few things that are most critical to the industry. And I think that we share that passion, but what are some of the trends that you think we should expect to see in the next, I would say years, but measure it in quarters. That's how aggressive we change, right? So in the next 4 quarters, I mean, do you see some monumental big shifts coming, changes in the mechanical solutions, changes in the way that maybe we don't require as much stuff on the electrical permutation, I don't know, but what are you seeing?
Yeah. So, I almost laugh saying this, because, with all the growth because of the cloud, I was like, the real opportunity has been, 5 years ago for these new companies and everything to kind of expand and become quite successful. But the reality is, I think with AI, we're just at the infancy again.
Isn't that crazy?
We were at the infancy 15 years ago, and so this is a 15, 20-year-old industry. But the reality is 20 years later, it's been reset. We're at the infancy. Even at the scale we're at now, we're at the infancy. So the opportunity is huge. Now, one of the things, I always tell people, we were a very different industry in the old days. It's like when I decide to buy some product for my house, I know I could plug it in the wall. It's going to be less than 15 amps at 120 volts. So I could buy whatever I want. It's inconsequential. It doesn't impact the ecosystem. The grid doesn't need to be upgraded because I'm plugged another TV at my house, right? It's a non-issue. That was our industry 15 years ago. We build a data center. No one cared. In fact, they looked at it as, oh, good, it might be some jobs we're getting. But we're now at a stage where I'm not plugging in, a 150 watt TV. Now all of a sudden I'm moving into the community. I'm plugging in, a megawatt TV. Well, guess what? The electrical wiring in the house can't handle it. My breakers can't handle it. Oh, by the way, the street can't handle it, right? All of a sudden, this is a nonlinearity. When I just had a few low power TVs, I plug them in. I could plug in as many as I wanted. It was totally a linear problem. I just buy a TV, plug it in. Data centers were the same way. Now we're that, 1 megawatt TV that we're plugging in. How does that change things? So I always had this thing, in my last 5 or 6 years at Microsoft, I led R&D team. And the whole purpose of that team was to look at the nonlinearities of the future, the plugging that 1 megawatt thing into that totally disrupts the whole ecosystem around it. And I came up with this concept called make the data center disappear. So how do we get cost out of the data center? How do we simplify the electrical? How do we think of networking differently? All these things. What about powering chips? How should we rethink chips? All these things became part of this R&D experiment because a lot of these linear environments, even Moore's law, which made everything very linear, is disappearing. So when you think about what we have to do in the future, we have to think differently. We have to build things differently. And we have to make the data center disappear so that I go to a community. When I go and I want to put my 1 megawatt TV into my house, how could I make it that no one or outside of my house even knows that I brought that 1 megawatt TV in? Now I've made that 1 megawatt TV disappear. No one cares. How do we make it so we could continue to grow and no one cares? Well, certainly there's the notion of powering things yourself, building your own power plant and so on. All things that, we were looking at, different technologies, whether it's hydrogen fuel cells and all these things that will enable us to bypass emissions concerns in communities and all these things. But the reality is, and now it's carbon, right? How do we actually make sure that we go in
and noise,
another one, right? All these things. And so it's still about making the data center disappearing, but I think we have to even think bigger and think along the lines of not just making it disappear, but ecologically making it transparent, making it invisible. We go into a community, and I remember even, there were pictures we had of a campus, and you show a building and then a vast amount of forest kind of bulldozed away, and it's like, we can't show that we have to have a close up because
we don't want to show that we're demolishing
all the forest, right? But the reality is that's at some point when your scale gets big enough, these things matter and our footprint matters. So how do we actually start thinking much more broadly? I went to a wedding in India in October, and the bride, Amanda, great person, she had this love for elephants. There's a whole story for why, but she wanted to save elephants. And so part of our tour of this destination wedding was to go to the elephant sanctuary. And these are elephants that are taken out of servitude, who've been abused and everything. And there's a relevance to this story you'll see in a minute. And it was heartbreaking to hear how elephants are treated. They showed us the bats with the spike on it that they beat the elephants if they get out of hand, and the spike chains they wear that get tightened if they don't behave when they're giving a ride to a child or something. And so it made me reflect about, when my kids were young in 2007 and we were in Thailand and Phuket, and there was an elephant on the beach. You pay and your kids could ride on it. And I looked at it and I go, yeah, I have to get my kids. So I paid and I had the kids ride on it. And I thought about that and I thought, man, that elephant didn't want to be there. And I actually paid to get my kids to ride that elephant. But at the end of the day, if I never had them ride that elephant, our quality of life and the experience would have never suffered, would have never been different. So the real question for me as we build data centers, what are those elephant-like cases that if I only knew I was disrupting this or creating a bad side effect,
you wouldn't be paying for it?
Would I not need it anyway? And maybe I'd just be careful on how I actually did things or design it out of the system or whatever. And then I started reflecting about PUE and how much PUE changed the industry. And so that's when, the R&D team I had, and Microsoft's been public about some of this stuff, is we need to start thinking about how do we actually, when we develop something, and when I say we, the industry, and not have as bad of an ecological impact just because now we're measuring. PUE, we didn't know how bad we were until we were measuring.
Yeah.
And so when I look at what, one of my passion projects is I work with a team called Ecometric Solution, where they've come up with a way to measure ecological impact. And this is like 20 years of work. They're just a consulting team right now with this product. It's starting to make traction in some companies and so on. But the beauty of it is it actually goes in and assesses relative to before development or before human intervention, the impact you have with your construction project. And today it's, it might be 15, 20% of the ecological performance you have after you build the data center than what you had before you went there. What if we could start consciously knowing if I make this change, that change, I could actually improve that metric and bring it closer to 100%. Now, that's a big thing to get to 100%, but it might be just little things like not giving your kid a ride on the elephant that could completely change the outcome to where we get to 50% rather than 15%. And so metrics to me are key. And so I want to see us kind of start looking at, and like I said, some companies are already ahead of the game because that's a nonlinearity. Ecosystem impact is a nonlinearity. When you're small, if I'm walking in the forest by myself, I have no ecological impact. But if I have 100 people walking with me in the forest, that's going to have ecological impact. And so how can we change how we behave so that we impact the ecosystem around us, which is critical for our survival, especially as population increases?
I think that that's a whole nother subject that we should delve into in the future, if not like a DCAC live. I think maybe that's something that needs a deeper dive, right?
I'll be happy to even talk about how you actually measure and do those things. So I think that's one of the key things. I'm also quite passionate, and I'm working with an organization to be part of the consortium thing we were talking about. I think consortiums will be the future where people who competed have to work together.
It's a collective.
It's a collective, right? And then part of my
the ecosystem of the industry that's going to support you as you guys begin to do that will have no choice but to do the same.
Yeah.
There'll be a consolidation too.
Oh, probably. Which unfortunately, when that happens, it becomes less nimble too. Right.
But it becomes institutionalized. It's easier to maintain that standard. You still need the outliers that are disruptive, that are going to change those things, but you're always going to have them.
Yeah. And then, on top of that, I still have a keen interest in helping the industry continue to expand. So I'm definitely staying involved in all the stuff that I've done before and hope to continue that stuff. Not as a full-time employee, but you'll see me and there'll be announcements of me serving on boards and things like that. Keep my wheels turning. I'm not dead yet.
Well, no, listen, I was wondering, what do you tell people you do for a living?
What do I tell people? That's a great question. So what do I tell people? Well, as of right now, I've been telling people I'm retired, but I tell people that I like to go out and help companies and advise them and help them steer their strategy for the future. I mean, that's ultimately what I always loved doing.
So it's interesting because that's a really hard question. I think I ask everybody that question, and I don't ever get the same answer. But some people talk about it from broad strokes, like, "Hey, man, I help businesses," and some are really more not myopic, but they get really granular into, "Hey, I build better data centers. I build the sky for the cloud," as Cyrus one would say, right? So I'm always fascinated by those things because it also transcends into your passions, right? So just helping people seems to be the thing that's most important to you,
right? And I want to definitely land, and I started with this, that my why is really to solve the seemingly impossible. By really inspiring others to think bigger. And I think that's the key thing for our success. And everything I do is to help people think bigger than me, right? I'm at the tail end of my career. We really need to be inspiring others to think big and think beyond the boundaries that they are normally working in, because it's always that interface. The opportunity is always at the interface of what you don't know.
Well, listen, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm sad to have to wrap this one up, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to get you back again, right? Because if it's your purpose and your why is to continue to inspire, I hope that you allow this platform to be one of those that you use to amplify that voice. Because not only do I want to have you, but I want those other yous that have really helped break open this industry and pioneer this industry. I'm hoping to get their voices all collective as well. So we're rowing in the same sheet of music, or singing from the same sheet of music, they say, right? We're trying to do the same thing you're trying to do it. You're at another altitude and airspeed, and I represent a smaller group of people that are the ecosystem that tries to bring these visions to life that you guys create, or these people create, I should say. So,
but just remember one thing: in another 10, 15 years, you're going to be the one that takes it beyond even the people that you're talking to.
Well, I hope so, right? And but that's only possible if I continue to have the opportunity to sit down with yous and the Peters and the Crosbys and guys and have them educate me. Really, and your story is what educates, and your story is what inspires. So I know that this was a big reach and a big ask for you to come here, and I really appreciate you taking the time. I hope it was worth the trip.
Well, I just want to thank you, certainly your organization and certainly the industry at large for being really such a collaborative and really great place to be.
No, I agree. It's the greatest industry. It's the best kept secret. We need to change that.
Yep. Okay.
Thanks, Christian.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.